Ja, dann schönen guten Abend im Kreisky-Forum. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie an so einem schönen sonnigen Abend zu uns gefunden haben. Ich werde aber jetzt gleich auf Englisch wechseln, weil wir heute einen Gast aus UK haben, der uns hier über Zoom zugeschaltet ist. Stuart Parkinson von der Gruppe Scientists for Global Responsibility, ein Think Tank, eine Research Platform, wo Wissenschaftler aus unterschiedlichsten Disziplinen zusammenkommen. Welcome, Stuart. I'm just introducing you in German, but now I switch in English for real. Thank you so much for making time and joining us via Zoom from Britain today. You will briefly introduce Scientists for Global Responsibility as part of your presentation, but thank you so much for making time and joining us today. Stuart has been one of among the pioneers of studying the military footprint, the climate footprint of the military in a European context, together with activists and NGOs in the UK. And he will begin our evening today with a summary of the findings, really, that he was able to identify in his study. Next to me, we have Franz Essl, who is joining us from Vienna. Franz Essl, I'm sure many of you know, ecologist specializing in biodiversity, and he's also leading a research group on biodiversity at the University of Vienna. Thank you for making time also.
Thanks for the invitation, Monica.
Okay, so on that note, Stuart, can I invite you to kick us off and share the findings of your report on the climate footprint of European militaries with us, and after that we will hopefully engage in a fruitful discussion about your findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. Thank you for inviting me, and great to be here. I shall just share my screen. I've got slides to show you. Always think it's good to show a few pictures with the words. So let's just get the technology working. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about military carbon emissions and take you through some of the data that I and colleagues have uncovered, and what does it say about the past, present, and future of military carbon emissions. So just briefly for those who aren't familiar with our organisation, we're a research and advocacy organisation based in the UK. We have a membership of several hundred scientists and engineers, and we have a range of concerns. The ones most relevant for the webinar today is the climate change in general, militarism in science and technology, and military greenhouse gas emissions in particular. And over the past 3-4 years, we've published 3 reports on UK, EU, and global military greenhouse gas emissions, and 2 technical papers with a range of partners and funders, particularly including the Conflict and Environment Observatory in the UK. So start you off with a brief diagram of the military carbon blueprint, the main components of the military carbon blueprint. The key ones are in bold in the middle of this. So military equipment use and military bases are sort of the central core elements of military carbon emissions. Then on the other elements on the left-hand side, you've got a range of supply chains, military technology industry, a whole range of other suppliers, from fossil fuels to uniforms, land use, waste management. And then on the right-hand side of the diagram are a range of impacts from warfighting itself. So when fires break out in urban areas or in rural areas, healthcare of casualties, post-conflict reconstruction are some of the bigger ones. And then I've also mentioned the issue of nuclear war and the potential of nuclear winter, but I won't go into that today. Save that for another day. So the key terminology I'm going to refer to is core carbon emissions, and there are other terms that are used for this as well. There's no consistent terminology, unfortunately. This includes direct fuel use of military vehicles, direct fuel use of military bases, particularly heating, and electricity use on military bases in particular for various equipment. The carbon footprint is the core emissions plus the supply chain upstream, so things like military industry, military technology industry, and all the other suppliers, raw material extraction as well. And then carbon bootprint is an extra definition that we've come up with, which includes the impacts of warfighting as well. So I'm going to give you some figures for these different elements of the carbon emissions. And just to say, I will use carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions interchangeably, just to make sure you're clear on that one. So greenhouse gas emissions data, there are a range of sources. They're generally not very good. The one, I guess the data source which is biggest is the national greenhouse gas inventories. The reports published under the UNFCCC for most industrialized countries and larger nations. There's military data in there, but it's generally very poor, it's inconsistent, it's mixed with civilian data. I've found it to be unusable. And it also excludes data of military activities in international areas. So it's very problematic. There is some better data published by some defense ministries, particularly in NATO and the EU. So I use more of that and corporate data from some of the larger international military technology companies. Again, there's some data there, and so I use some of that. And then there's various academic studies and non-governmental organization studies, and we draw on all sorts of analog data, proxy data, and things like civilian, similar civilian industry. So we use some data from there. Some economic models are useful there as well. And it's worth remembering that the IPCC has published no data in this. If you look in the IPCC reports, it's mentioned occasionally as an issue, but there is no data on military carbon emissions at all. And a lot of this arises because of a decision made at the 1997 climate conference, which excludes military emissions in international space from international airspace, international oceans, from being reported. And that's also kind of led to a problem of a lot of data being hidden or mixed up with civilian data. So you have to keep looking at other data sources, and I've listed some of the data sources there that we use. So, okay, that's the problems. Now here's some of the data that we've estimated. The first thing to note, these are the largest EU, 6 largest military spending nations in the EU. There's the data in blue, that's the reported emissions reported to the UN Climate Convention. And you can see what a small fraction that is of the total carbon footprint, and why I think it's so problematic. And then you've got countries like France and Poland don't report any at all, or at least for this particular year. That may have changed since. I haven't checked the latest ones. So we've estimated the carbon footprint for these countries, the military carbon footprint for these countries. So that's including the core carbon emissions, fuel use, energy use of bases, and then estimates for supply chain emissions as well. And then when you include UK emissions as well, you can see that the UK is even larger than France, which is the largest in the EU by far. And you can see that, yeah, I think an interesting figure, for example, is the UK military carbon footprint per head that we've estimated is about 3 times per head of population than that of Germany. So you can see that the very energy intensive emissions of countries that have a large military and use it internationally are particularly high. When you start to compare European emissions to US emissions, for example, and I've also included the Ukraine war emissions here, I'll come to that in a minute, you see just how big the US carbon footprint is. So there's some data on US core emissions that's about 56 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Using a similar supply chain multiplier as we used in the UK, that turns into over 200 million tons for the whole carbon footprint. And you can see that's about 6 times larger than the European carbon footprint, EU plus the UK. And if you compare it with Ukraine war, data from the Ukraine war, which I think you had in a seminar a couple of weeks ago, the data on the first 7 months of that war, just warfighting data shows that that itself is larger than the annual emissions of all the major European countries. And then you've got reconstruction as well in the orange in the central bar there, which would add on to that, obviously after the conflict is finished, whenever that may be. But you can see the carbon footprint estimates in the USA and the UK and the EU. They do not include warfighting emissions of any of the wars that those countries have been involved in. And you can see that in the Ukraine war, warfighting emissions can be very large. What about the global situation? Well, there's even less data here. So we've extrapolated from the data in NATO and EU countries, using various proxy data like military personnel data, data on the ratio between stationary emissions, emissions at military bases, to mobile emissions, so the use of military equipment. And we've estimated that it's somewhere in the region of 500 million tons per year, around 1% of global emissions, a wide range of uncertainty. That gives you an idea. So that's core military emissions. And when you include a military carbon footprint, we estimated it was possibly 5.5%. And that would be equivalent to, if it were a country, the global world's militaries were a country, then it would be larger than Russia's total carbon footprint. Again, the uncertainty range is high. And this is one of the problems with the data, but at least it gives you an order of magnitude estimate. And it's important to remember that that's the military carbon footprint, so it doesn't include warfighting impacts. It doesn't include another important factor, which is what's called radiative forcing by aviation. So when emissions from jets in the stratosphere occurs, there are additional warming factors that happen there, and that's a significant multiplier as well. So yeah, so these emissions are likely to be higher. But again, they just to mention again, the supply chain multiplier is especially uncertain here, and that's on the basis of various economic models. And yeah, there are different estimates of those around as well. If we look at a bit at historical data, there's a couple of bits of historical data that are worth looking at. This is data from Brown University in the USA about US military core emissions. And the line to look at is the black line, total emissions over the last 45 years or so. And you can see quite clearly that when wars come to an end, so the Vietnam War in the late 70s, or the end of the Cold War in the 90s, or the end of the Iraq War in the early 2010s, you can see emissions come down quite significantly. And then they go up again when there's conflict being fought. And what this graph points to is that there are major decreases when military activity reduces, when the number of bases, number of personnel, number of vehicles reduces. And there are a few background factors like a shift away from coal for heating and electricity use that helps to reduce emissions as well. They tend to be smaller than the reduction in the size of the military. But that's the clear indication from that graph. But one of the things it does point to is that the role of energy efficiency improvements or shifts in military technology, that's a lot more difficult to draw out of this data. We have a similar situation in the UK. So there's two sets of longer term data from the UK. One is for military aircraft and shipping, which goes back to 1990. And the other data set is military bases, the lower graph, which goes back to 2010. And you can see that in the 1990s, again, you see that reduction in military emissions as the UK military shrank after the end of the Cold War, a rise again around the time of the Iraq War, and then falling again, and then particularly falling further after 2010. And there were military spending cuts in the UK, and that led to another set of reductions. And then they flattened out after about 2015, a blip for COVID in 2020, and now the indications are they're starting to rise again. For the military bases, you've got a fairly linear reduction over the 10-year period. There are two reasons for that. In particular, one is that electricity from the national grid, which supplies most military bases, that's been decarbonising because of a shift away from coal. And the other reason is that the UK military has reduced its number of military personnel. So those two factors are about even in reducing those emissions. And again, the role of energy efficiency improvements or shifts in military technology beyond the basic shift away from coal in the energy supply, it's very hard to tell that. And indeed, the sting in the tail is right at the bottom. The latest data for military bases that have just been published in the last year or so has revised the figures up by 40%. So it shows that there's an underreporting bias already in this data, or in the military bases data, and that shows the problem of militaries not being very experienced at measuring their data, reporting their data. So even the data that is reported is not ideal. So what about the military spending increases that are happening at the moment? You can see global military spending is about $2.2 trillion in to use American terminology. 3.7% increase in 2022 in Europe, 13% increase with more to come. And against that background, when the data I've just shown you shows that military carbon emissions tend to rise and fall with military activity, personnel bases, vehicles, and generally, or a bit more indirectly with spending, and it shows you it's very difficult to bring down military carbon emissions against a background of rising military spending. And whilst there is one factor, the decarbonisation of the energy sector, the electricity sector in particular, which is going to help bring down emissions against a rising military spending scenario, it's going to be very hard for overall emissions to fall at all. And the one I'll just finish with what the militaries are looking at their strategies for reducing emissions is sort of going green. There's a couple of quotes here that I've got from the UK military, which puts it in terms of defence will seek to use the transition to add to capabilities, whereas the Americans are a bit more direct, more fight, less fuel. Those strategies which talk about reducing the carbon emissions of weapon systems, as I've said, there's very little indication that improving energy efficiency of these technologies makes much difference, because basically if you improve the fuel efficiency of a jet, you tend to fly it further, or you tend to give it more bombs to carry. And energy efficiency is something the military has been interested in for decades, and yeah, that's what tends to happen. So the hope from their perspective is for technology shifts. But all these have various problems. So a move towards drones because they're smaller and lighter, but that's leading to an AI, artificial intelligence arms race. And that has many problems around the use of autonomous weapons and unaccountability of military action, things like that. You've got more nuclear power, but do you want the radiological risks and the proliferation risks that will bring? Batteries, but they're heavy and they're based on limited materials. Biofuels, there are a lack of sustainable sources. Synthetic fuels are still on the drawing board, really, just barely out of the lab. And the big problem there is there's a huge energy input required to create them. And then the final one that they're talking about is offsetting. So planting trees on military land or buying carbon credits, but those are already being shown to be ineffective. And it brings us back to the conclusion that we need a better approach to security. We need to find ways to make our militaries smaller, restructure them so we don't need them to be so large. We need to tackle the roots of conflict. And I think that's a nice place to stop so we can have a bit more of a discussion about that.
Yes, thank you very much, Stuart. This was a very comprehensive overview. And just to pick up on the last slide, which is basically the question with which we started our conversation to both of you, looking at the numbers, does that mean the end of the climate goals? We are already struggling on the level of civic infrastructure to stay beyond 2 degrees temperature rise. But looking at the increase you're prognosticating here, that's the end of any kind of climate ambition stated in the past, right?
Well, it's very difficult. Yes, it is very difficult. I think the possibilities are that civilian areas and civilian governments are realizing this is a much more important issue, and there are stronger targets being brought in and stronger measures being brought in. We need to encourage that. The military are using the excuse that we need a bigger military in a climate constrained world because of the possibility of conflict. But that's kind of flawed reasoning, in that conflict is only something that comes into play due to climate change if you don't do anything else before then. So if you don't reduce emissions, if you don't do adaptation, if you don't do disaster relief or disaster management, and if you don't do things like improving the way countries are governed, so that they're more accountable and help people in need at an earlier stage of the situation and reduce the vulnerabilities of the wider population. So if you do all those things, then you don't get to the point of conflict, and that's one of the conclusions of the IPCC. So the argument that we need bigger militaries is one that I think we need to challenge.
Thank you.
Well, I understand your question as a bit of provocative, of course, also, because 95% or so, I mean, there's quite some uncertainty, are still not caused by military greenhouse gas emissions, but by actual emissions that are caused by the civil sector. That's still the vast majority. So in essence, the climate policy, the major part will be decided in this sector, and it's really depending on the ambition of policy and implementation of these policies. And I mean, it cannot be used as an excuse. Even these quite impressive numbers, and I mean, also worrying numbers shown in these reports, they cannot serve as an excuse for inactivity in other sectors that are still quite more important, yeah, in deciding the fate of the climate of the future. But that's my first point. My second point would be, what I would also see, it's really impressive, 5%, and you compared it to it's even larger than the considerable climate footprint of a very large country like Russia, being the 4th emitter on the globe also. That shows that emissions and the climatic impact of this large sector, whose data are well hidden for understandable reasons, because many countries do not want to report data on the military in general, and also most likely also not data on the climatic implications of the military activities they have. But it shows that this sector also has to be first included much more comprehensively in climate reporting, also in the data. I think that's one point you already made, Stuart. And for me, it also highlights another issue. That's my final point for the start here. That security policy in a world that's rapidly changing and threatened by a number of also non-conventional threats, at least non-conventional threats from the perspective of, let's say, the military maybe. Because many of the existential threats that society, well, is starting to face, are not primarily military ones. They often may lead to military conflicts or to conflicts within societies, not necessarily upheavals or whatever, because we are overusing, destroying, the environmental space, the planetary boundaries, climatic ones, but also other resources, biodiversity overexploitation, in a way that it creates conflicts. So I think an appropriate architecture has to rethink and also integrate these challenges in a way that goes far beyond military expenditures, and also would probably mean that the expenditures that are earmarked for, let's say, expansion of military should maybe be reallocated to other elements of such a security architecture. Yeah.
We return to the relationship between climate change and conflict in a second. I just wanted to go back to some of the data you were presenting, Stuart. You mentioned how hard it is and how little forthcoming militaries by definition are about any of their activities. But out of curiosity, how long did it take to obtain relevant data? And how much was then finally available somewhere? And how much did you actually have to force out of these institutions by Freedom of Information Acts, disclosure legislation, etc.?
We didn't actually use Freedom of Information Act requests at all. All of the data that we used was published. So this is the interesting thing. The national security is used as a reason for not publishing this data, but actually when militaries want to publish it, they do publish it. And some of them, it's interesting, the evolution in Britain, that they've been publishing data on military carbon emissions, on core military carbon emissions for over 10 years, quite voluntarily. They haven't publicized it very well. There have been various problems in the way that they've compiled it, in the way that they've reported it, which we've criticized them on. They are getting better, and it's interesting just how good the latest data set is, even if it does show that they've missed a whole bunch of emissions. But it kind of shows you, in a country with as large a military as the UK, if they can do that, what's the excuse everybody else has got? And it's interesting that actually in the US, for years, you can see the data going back to 1975 on the military carbon emissions there. That was compiled from energy use data, which again is freely published and has been for over 40 years. So a lot of this data is already out there, and it has been out there for a long time. It's just there hasn't been much attempt to draw it together and try and estimate total emissions, and also use that to put pressure on other countries and say, wait a minute, they're doing it and there's no national security issues, so why aren't you doing it? And that's starting to happen now. It's interesting that NATO, because they have declared an interest in this issue, has started to push NATO countries to report better on this area, and we need that to happen more. Unfortunately, the one criticism I would make of NATO on this issue is that they've said they have created a methodology for reporting for countries, but they haven't actually published it openly, and they haven't explained why, and that's just very strange.
One important point is nonetheless to distinguish between different types of armies. I mean, the US being the biggest army in the world, and we know that the Department of Defense is the worldwide the biggest emitter of all in terms of energy consumption and CO2 emissions. So I think there's also a need to kind of distinguish between different sets of armies or regional alliances like NATO. But nonetheless, what does the data really then tell us? Like, how deep into the supply chain are you really able to dig with the research you have already done? Because speaking of the civilian sector still having the major responsibility, in the US, it is a major employer. You can hardly separate the military from the civic infrastructure. So how much of the military industry or equipment, weapons, arms industries is really captured in your estimates?
Some of the bigger companies do publish the data. They publish their core military emissions. And again, because it's sort of becoming more normal across major corporations to publish data in this area, and it's being pushed by national governments, particularly where they're listed on stock exchanges, on major stock exchanges, whether that's in the US, the UK, the EU. There's a genuine push for that, and then that's starting to ripple down further. That gives you an idea of emissions within individual companies. Then supply chain emissions, that's much harder to do. And the data that I've tried to put together there, I've drawn from some environmental economic models that I know some researchers in the UK and been able to draw on that data. And that data should be much more widely published. And again, I think that those studies could be done more widely. Particularly again in OECD countries, for example, there's a lot of economic data that could be used to make the estimates of supply chain emissions there. And we've also used some of the analogs, compared it with data from the civilian sector, similar sectors like civil aviation or some of the industrial sectors, just to sort of see how close it is. And that gives you an idea that there are data there that you can use analogs, but the broad argument is we just need a lot more people researching in this area, and that's one of there's just hardly anybody. It's, you know, a lot of it is just a few people in not very well funded NGOs doing most of the research because we're concerned, and it is quite amazing that actually there's so little done on this, and the IPCC is virtually silent on it.
And even in public debate, I mean, everyone is focusing on people gluing themselves onto the streets, everyone demonizing people who are still driving cars, etc. But the military has been pretty much absent from climate activism, even in Austria, right? It is still an issue that needs to be staged as a public concern, not least for democratic decision-making on matters of not just war and peace, but also the consequences of war. And here on this particular point, I wonder how, from the perspective of a biodiversity ecological researcher, where your research intersects with the military, or how much in your field even the military and war have played a role.
Well, actually, my research is not really focusing on the impact of military activities or military planning on biodiversity so much. But still, there are a few points I would like to make. And the interesting point is these points point into these points I would like to make point into different direction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that maybe sounds a bit perverse because some of the effects are actually, from a biodiversity point, positive. And I start with the positive one. In Austria, there are a few large training grounds, including military training grounds, including Allensteig, which is actually the largest training ground for military purposes in Central Europe. But there are also other large training grounds. Another one, I will come back afterwards, is Großmittel near Wiener Neustadt. And one characteristic of many training grounds, not only in Austria, but generally speaking, is that these military training grounds have been established often in marginal areas peripheral areas because it's easier to establish there because there's less conflicts with landowners or other land use types. And once they have been established, access for non-military people is not allowed usually, and actually non-military activities also have ceased or largely, which means in our nowadays very intensively used landscape, these military training grounds have sometimes become refuges for many species. To give you an example, in Allensteig, in the Waldviertel area, I mean, of course, I'm sure all you know, wolves are coming back to Central Europe, also to Austria. And the first pack of wolves with offspring was recorded actually in Allensteig, because it's one of the largest areas where there is little disturbance by humans. Großmittel, the second one I mentioned before, training ground, military one, is the largest remaining area of more or less intact steppe grasslands in Eastern Austria, because there was never agricultural land use allowed, because the farmers have not been given access to it. I'm not making this point to promote military activities, but I'm just making the point there may be, let's say, perversive outcomes that actually point to the fact that the current landscape use we have in Austria and in many other countries it's quite similar, is so intensive that by chance, there was never the purpose by military activities, of course, to create something like conservation areas. Yeah, that's maybe one point. However, that's also specific. Yeah, there are also, and of course, many more side effects of military activities that are harmful or even disastrous to conservation activities, or, well, to the intactness of nature, if you want. For instance, some of the remote islands have also been used for military bases, because for strategic reasons. And one is, for instance, Guam, which had a very important role in the Pacific War between Japan and the US. Yeah, it was one of the, has been converted in one of the major bases in the rollback of the Japanese empire forces by the US from 1943 onwards. So it has a huge airfield and is even now basically a military island. Yeah. And in the Pacific, tropical Pacific. And military activities have introduced a number of species, alien species, including a snake, tree snake, that actually wiped out more or less the total native bird fauna, resulting in the global extinction of several endemic species that only occurred on Guam. Another military activity outcome in Europe, I would like to highlight, was the introduction by military airplanes, big airplanes that have been starting in the US in the context of the war situation in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And these military planes that started in the Corn Belt in the US, military airfields, actually imported a pest species for corn production, maize production in Europe, the corn rootworm. That's now the main pest in maize cultivation in Europe. Yeah, a huge multi-billion issue, because it really causes very large losses of yields in corn. As a consequence of the military-related flight activities between former Yugoslavia and the US. There are a number of other activities, like in the oceans. One of the techniques widely used or increasingly used also by military is sonar, which means that's a mean how you can echolocate submarines, for instance, or other devices underwater. And this is quite powerful and also very loud for underwater mammals, for instance. Yeah. And there are increasingly reports that the sonar has become so powerful, actually so loud, that it really impacts the physical integrity of whales or dolphins sometimes, that in the end die or become disoriented and beach on somewhere. But as I said, you find positive examples, yeah, which I would not use for justifying a general, that can, in my opinion, not be used for justifying military expansion or a limited and narrow approach to security architecture that I wanted, that I mentioned before. But of course, there are many more impacts that have, well, detrimental to devastating impacts on biodiversity.
And like you said, it's not the military designation of the land, it's the fact that it was closed for any toxic activity, such as agriculture or people.
But but there are very few activities in policymaking that have such a strong standing and power. Actually, no other activity really closes large tracts of land for the general public. To my opinion, or to my knowledge, it's only military that's of overriding or assumed to be of overriding importance. So in the end, that's
but it is kind of a deflection. But I think it tells us a lot about what is given priority in terms of the rigidity or the enforcement of certain types of law. Yeah. And on that note, it's quite interesting. You see the same in Chernobyl. This exclusion zone around the exploded reactor that has been closed off because it's just too dangerous to be there. Everyone imagine these kind of distorted animals. No, it has become a refuge for rare and almost extinct species there up until the occupation by the Russians. It has been a flourishing environment because no one was able to go there. But like you said, we also see the reverse, where in fact natural resorts, like in the case of Nishemi, for instance, where one of the largest listening or on the land radio stations of the US military has been placed, which is organizing the entire intelligent warfare of the US towards the Eastern world, which is a major environmental concern for the local population, but also for bird migration, etc. Mm-hmm. And on that point, a question to both of you. We talk a lot when we think of the relationship military and climate change of fossil fuels, CO2 emissions. But what about the electronic infrastructure, which is not only energy intensive, but also interferes with magnetic fields, with radiation streams that animals, plants may use for orienting their behaviors, migration, etc. Has anyone studied this? What is the impact we are seeing there? Or even data centers consuming exorbitant amounts of energy?
In terms of energy use, if they're military owned, then they come under military bases, and their energy use will be recorded as part of military bases. In terms of effects of radioactive, electromagnetic radiation, I've not seen work on that, I'm afraid. That's not my area.
Yeah, that's also crossing the boundaries of my knowledge to some extent, I have to admit. I assume there may be some understanding of how this interferes with like orientation of animal species, migrating species that use similar techniques for migrating or orientation in space. But I cannot give a deep answer on that. I'm sorry for that. Yeah.
But what is for sure missing, and you mentioned this, Stuart, is active combat is missing by and large, and training operations in international territories, waters, or international training organizations. And I wonder, how much are we actually missing when we don't have any idea in terms of emissions there? And how is it actually, how would our climate models improve? Would we have this kind of data available?
I think that there's different types of data gaps. So for example, climate scientists use climate models with data on fossil fuel extraction, and that's total fossil fuel extraction, and that includes for any use. So unless it's being extracted by a country for military use and being completely hidden from the international system, which it may be possible in a Middle Eastern authoritarian country, perhaps. But I don't think it's happening beyond that. So that data will still be used for climate modeling for estimating what climate change will be due to global effects. But it won't be included in international targets for reducing emissions. So the national reporting won't cover it unless countries make a deliberate decision to include it. And it's interesting that the UK does include some international military emissions within its national carbon statistics. So it can be done. And there is greater moves to include international civil aviation and international shipping within carbon targets in the UK and in the EU. So that can be done. It needs a bit of effort from decision makers. It's starting to happen, but it needs more effort. But as I say, I don't think it's excluded in projections of how the climate will change at a global level. But I think in terms of targets for controlling emissions, then it probably is a significant amount is being lost.
Okay, so let's return then to the question of war and climate change. One of the main arguments, both of you have mentioned it, is from the perspective of the military. Climate change is perceived as a major risk for increasing conflicts or the number of wars even. Is that in fact so? If we look at social studies, the relationship between climate change and conflict is in fact very inconclusive. There is no causal link that can be established. Climate change can certainly intensify existing tensions and precarious conditions, increasing food insecurity, we know this. But if anything, people are saying when it comes to rare resources like water, for instance, etc., you most often find that they are more a pacifying force, leaving countries like India, Pakistan, Jordan, and Israel to collaborate rather than fight over those resources. And yet, there's this insistence on the behalf, at least of the military, to cast climate change as a major risk and threat. If that is so, that would actually suggest we need to invest much more in climate adaptation and mitigation. And yet what we're actually seeing is military spending rising, whereas climate adaptation and mitigating are still voluntary payments, slowly coming forward. How can we explain this discrepancy?
Well, maybe I would like to start first with my view on this, on the interaction between future risks to security issues on a country scale, and how this interacts with degraded environments or changing climate. And first I would state one of the key implications of climate change and also degraded environments is that resources that people depend on, this may be water, this may be food production, that may be a number of other essential products in the end, will be affected spatio-temporally and also in the quantity by climatic changes or environmental degradation, usually leading to a depletion of these resources. And this, of course, interacts with societies, with societal structures, with governance, with political decision-making, and also, but it's in fact causing stress, societal stress. Directly and indirectly, it has ramifications. And of course, the root causes of conflicts are often complex, and usually it's not like one root that leads to a conflict situation within a country or among countries. But what, in my opinion, is quite clear, and also I would argue quite accepted, that this stress raises the risks of conflicts of different kinds. So reflecting this, and also being aware that I think it's already quite widely accepted knowledge. Maybe I would like just to cite one important report that's made every year. It's a global risk report that's issued not by an NGO or a left-leaning organization. That's issued by the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the World Risk Report is basically based on more or less on a survey among global leaders, especially in economic forum, so of global enterprises. And since a few years already, the top 5 risks are, broadly speaking, environmental ones. These are not like classical geopolitical risks. I'm not sure about this year. Maybe Ukraine has changed it for the current situation. But in principle, global leaders have already become to the point of conclusion that the main risks are environmental degradation. That means extreme climate events, widespread harvest failure, reaching climatic tipping points, and a few other ones. Yeah. So coming back to the question, it's clear, recognizing these insights and also what I said before, that the additional stress caused by a failed climatic policy and a failed environmental protection policy on a global level, but also on more regional levels, this has severe implications how actually security architecture should be understood, defined, and also what this would actually mean for allocating resources. Yeah, because if you invest, let's say, more or less solely in military expenditures, which in my opinion can very hardly be decarbonized. I'm not sure if there will at any time be an e-tank or something like that. And if so, yeah, but still. Yeah, this narrow framing that's still dominating the sector is leading into a direction where it doesn't account for the new, or not even totally new, but for the changed in geopolitical and security situation basically countries are facing. And this would lead to a recognition of cooperation, would also lead to a much stronger enforcement of climatic policies, also underpinned by security concerns, I would say. That would also make a strong point for thinking about social security and equity, and also of inclusion of people who are not well represented in communities or political entities that may lead to extremism and other forms that may also become violent. So that causes a huge arena of new questions that have then a very different importance in this discourse, in my opinion.
But at the same time, I mean, you mentioned the World Economic Forum. Also implied here is these risk discourse and risk scenarios don't operate in an interest-free space. They have become subject to many, many different discourses that can be mobilized, of course, to support your own interests. And that's precisely my point. What are the consequences coming out of this realization? Wait a minute, climate change is actually something that we as representatives of the leading industrial nations should be concerned about. If you look at the consequences, so what are the suggestions to mitigate these risks coming out of these economic forums? Are they increasing investment in climate mitigation, adaptation, supporting nations in the South most affected by climate change?
I understand this cited World Risk Report and also the discussion there as a proof of the understanding of the severity of the risks, even of the existentiality of the risks humanity is facing. I'm not sure how much this is also be affected, and of course it will be, at least to some extent, let's say by interest represented by these leaders coming together. But in principle, I would consider it a sincere assessment of risks per se, which are not yet translated in the extent that would be appropriate to respond adequately to these risks on the political level and on the level of, especially of implementation. On the political level, many of these risks have been addressed appropriately. The Paris Agreement, in fact, would be, if it would be pursued by the countries in the way it has been assigned several years ago, then climate policy would be in a very different shape. So the big gap is the implementation. So I think the security discourse would be another call and another layer of arguments for actually steering societies in such a way. Yeah.
I'm just concerned if there's not a risk of securitizing climate change rather than looking at the historical picture, because what is completely absent from this climate change as this new global security threat is the fact that what caused many wars in the past has precisely been the energy need or the greed for energy by the industrialized nation. If you look at the Middle East, if you look at Africa, etc., it was these energy needs that triggered either wars or at least geopolitical power relations that created this infrastructure of global military bases. They are ultimately, you can trace them to the resources located in these areas where the military bases are. So this historical dimension is somehow missing, and I wonder if the recognition of climate change as a security risk is also factoring in our own implication in these risks.
I fully agree that this historic, I mean, not given the huge importance of climate, well, of energy security in terms, and you can see the consequences if these established energy supply lines are affected, especially in a shock way like last year. So that countries in many places on Earth actually really invested into soft and hard power related to the supply and supply chains of energy, and often not respecting other factors like the sovereignty of countries that actually own these resources. And of course, also in these countries which are actually rich in these resources, it also may have quite adverse consequences because these resources often are not equitably shared and create other issues in the country. So I fully agree on this aspect, but I don't see it as a contradiction. I think that's just underpins the huge importance of how we need also transformation in the energy system, yeah, which would also lead to a reshaping of these issues, because many of the, basically all of them, well, let's say climate neutral or near climate neutral energies, wind, solar, and other ones, have one major difference compared to classic fossil fuel-based energies. They are decentralized. Yeah, not totally, of course. In the tropics, you have higher solar potential than in the Arctic or even in temperate regions like Austria. But one major issue is they are decentralized. And if you look on how solar energy or also wind energy is being produced, it's produced decentralized. Yeah, you don't have huge solar fields where you can extract huge amounts of solar energy like in the Middle East in a few countries. So I would say it's more like a democratic source of energy, much more compatible also to democratic societies compared to this highly concentrated and very inequitably distributed forms of fossil energy that can also be much easier taken by interest groups, companies, or whatever, and used for own purposes.
I think that's the decentralization and the link to the democratizing aspect of it leads me to back to Stuart, your endpoint. We need to rethink our security policy, because that precisely is the question to what extent does energy and energy supply, a decentralized alternative renewable energy system, would need to move much closer in our understanding or in our ways of thinking security, national security, global security, thereby also stop thinking about leaving all security and defense questions solely in the hands of the military. How is energy consumption not also a part of civic defense or civic peacemaking in a way, peace building?
But there are a number of approaches that we could use. The United Nations has been pushing the idea of human security rather than national security, or at least a move from a narrowly based national security where the military is dominant to a broadly based human security where you're considering a range of impacts on individuals and communities. So that would help. And then you realize that issues that affect local communities are very different from some of the issues that affect nations, and actually the prioritization of that change the argument. Another way of looking at it is instead of climate security framing, you talk about a climate justice framing, and then it becomes clear about the inequalities in both access to energy and in the responsibility for emissions. So we have a situation at the moment in the world where about the richest 10% of the world's population are responsible for emitting about 50% of the world's carbon emissions. So that sort of inequality, and of course it's the most vulnerable, it's the poorest that are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So that's shifting the debates to one about justice and about human security would, if that logic was followed through at a government decision-making level, you would allocate resources very differently than the current model, which, as we've talked about, allocates about $2 trillion a year to the military, and it's growing. Yeah.
On that note, any questions from the audience? Anyone curious to learn more?